Chapter 32, Unworthy of Queenship. A royal decree welcomed us back to Orzammar. As soon as we arrived, a large force of the city guard insisted we follow them to the palace. It was a strange request, but not outside the realm of Father's power. I commanded the army forces that had joined us in our travels to return to their garrisons, while my personal guard and Farron accompanied me to the palace. I noticed a different air about the city as we passed through. Where normally dwarves would be cheering my arrival, there were now quick peeks and excited whispers. I wasn't sure what was going on, but it was certainly new and not altogether unwelcome. Something unexpected was always more interesting than the same old thing happening. When we arrived at the palace, the guards at the entrance allowed us quick entry and directed us to where Father was. Farron and I rushed through the palace only to find Trian waiting outside of Father's chambers. "Trian?" I asked in surprise. "You're still here?" Trian approached to give me a hug. "I am, sister. After Father made his announcement, we couldn't leave. We'll be needed here soon enough. I trust that you were successful in your effort to kill Solas?" I nodded, grim-faced. "We were. Prince Kaelin died in the effort, however." "I'm sorry to hear that," Trian responded before moving directly to business. "Father is waiting for you. He wished to tell you of his decision himself." "Should I be concerned?" I asked, canting my head curiously. "That's not for me to say," Trian dodged the question. "But it will put things in perspective for you." "That's disconcerting," I replied as I looked toward the door to Father's chambers. "Then relieve yourself of discontent and speak with Father," Trian pat my shoulder. "Go on, Merida." He nudged me gently as he used to do when I was still nervous about speaking with noble guests. Ironically, that's exactly how I was feeling just now. I moved to the door and stepped through, closing it behind me. I found Father sitting at his desk. Father turned and smiled at me. He stood and made his way to me, waving away my etiquette as I curtsied before him. Now, let's have none of that, my dear. Come, give your father a hug." I rose from my curtsy and wrapped my arms around him. "I've missed you, Father." "And I you, Merida," Father replied as he hugged my close. He stepped back, took my hand, and led me to a sofa. He guided me to sit. "I'm pleased to see you home safe. I was worried about you." "We lost several guards and Prince Kaelin fell in battle, but we were successful," I said with regret in my voice. "Prince Kaelin?" Father gasped. "Oh, poor Merrick. Kaelin was a fine lad and looked to be a good and fine heir. He was such a gentle soul. Do you remember the night you first met him?" I smiled sadly and let out a soft laugh before I nodded. "I do. He insisted on dancing with me the first night. It was such an awkward attempt. I don't think he'd considered our height difference at all. Still, he was a gentleman even then. And I killed him," I wanted to say. I wanted to scream it. I wanted to shout it, confess it. I wanted to tell Father what I had done and why. I wanted him to listen and understand. Would he understand? "Do you know how I became king?" Father asked as he read my face. I flinched, wanting to say no, but my expression told him I knew the truth, that he'd convinced his older brother to fight a murderer in approving, and had provided the poison that the murderer used on his blade. Father sighed. "What I did because I knew I was the best person to rule Orzammar. My brother was headstrong and hot-blooded. His patience was thin, and he was easily persuaded to do things a person with any wit wouldn't do. It was a sacrifice I made for the good of our people, one I do not regret now, but I did at the time. Soon you will need to learn to make such sacrifices. You've made similar choices yourself while retaking the Tags and at Ostagar." Frandlin and Orta's faces flashed before me at the mention of Ostagar. I paid and looked at Father. "What do you mean I will need to learn to make such sacrifices?" Father inhaled deeply. "I have come to the end of my reign, Merida. My memory is not what it used to be, and I am growing old. I have asked the assembly to call the leaders of the Tags so that they might all decide on a new ruler. Usually this would only be done after I had died, but I don't believe there is another choice beyond you, daughter. Still, traditions must be upheld, but I'm telling you now so that you can prepare yourself. You, Merida, will soon be named Queen of Orzammar." I stared at Father in shock and disbelief. It took me some time to find words, but they were words of protest about how he had plenty of time to rule yet. He assured me that this would be the best thing for Orzammar. It was too soon for any of this. I hadn't dealt with 7 yet, and had only just now finished handling Saulas. If I were queen, it would severely hamper my ability to travel and hunt for ways to keep the people of Orzammar safe. But the wheels had been set in motion, and there was nothing I could do. There would only be a month or two before everyone who would decide on the matter would arrive. Later that evening, after I'd returned home from Father's chambers, Farron and I sat by the fire. There was correspondence laid out in a pile between us, ranging from requests for meetings, funding, endorsements, house eligibility, and any number of other things from nearly every noble house or family in Orzammar. This was the price I paid for my travels. Whenever I returned home, I would have months of backlogged mail to get through. "Isn't that what you were working towards the entire time?" Farron asked as he finished penning a reply for me to a rather dubious business proposal in the most polite manner possible. "You know that's not why I've done all of this," I sighed as I looked over a letter asking for a meeting from House Ivo. I still considered them to be family and wondered what it was that they needed. I would certainly meet with them. "Everything I've done has been for the good of our people, not for political power or personal gain." "The personal gain hasn't hurt, though," Farron smirked. "Be that as it may," I said dismissively. "I was never trying to become queen. I'd honestly just wanted to do what was best for everyone while I remained a good advisor to Trian." "Who already stepped aside publicly in your favor back when you were 11, Farron reminded me. "I know," I grumbled. "I could strangle him for that. Being queen will limit me more than it will help. If I can't freely travel, how am I going to handle 7? "You might not need to," Farron suggested. "He hasn't made himself known for years until the proving, and even then it was an attack that we'd quickly put down." "I'm still uneasy that he killed Core if EUS in that way," I mused. "If he has Core if EUS soul within him, he may have grown exponentially stronger." "Something to plan for and use your influence as queen, then," Farron replied as he opened another sealed letter. Before I could respond, a knock came from the door to the study. Kyla popped her head in and smiled at us. "Princess, Varric is here as you requested." "Thank you, Kyla," I smiled back. She was all smiles these days whenever she looked at me and Farron now, knowing that we were to be wed. "Please, show her in." Kyla disappeared from the doorway and Varric sauntered in. He stopped near the table where all the letters were piled on and whistled. "Gotta say, Braids, you're pretty popular." I smiled. Braids was Varric's nickname for me since I'd never cut my hair but kept it styled in thick braids. He was the only person who ever called me anything other than princesses or paragon, apart from Farron or my family who would just call me by my name. "You're more than welcome to answer them all for me," I snickered. "Me?" Varric asked. "Nah, you wouldn't want me to do that. I'd have too much fun seeing what I could get all the nobles to do just to get an audience for you. Then again, seeing Lady Trieste try to juggle mugs of ale while balancing on a ball would be a sight." Farron and I both chuckled at the thought. "What brings you here, Varric?" I asked. Varric reached into his coat and produced a rolled-up map. This. He moved the letters to the side and unrolled the map onto the table. The Grey Warden commanders were reluctant to give out these locations, but we managed to convince them that you could get to the tombs where no one else could. I gasped and stood up from my chair to look at the map. They gave us the location of the final 2 tombs? Varric nodded and tapped 2 red X's. One was in the Free Marches, while another was in Orlais. Here and here. They said that they have garrisons in the spots to try and look for darkspawn activity, but since they can't actually get to the tombs themselves, tunneling darkspawn aren't likely to be spotted. I rolled my eyes. The wardens were excellent warriors, but sometimes they could be a bit short-sighted. "Will they allow us to handle the old gods?" Varric seemed to hesitate before answering. "They would prefer that you not disturb the old gods. Something about them keeping vigil and not kicking the hornet's nest." "You've got to be kidding me," Farron growled as he stood to join us. "Merida could kill the old gods while they slept the moment she got close enough to them. Why wouldn't they want her to do that?" "You know, I asked myself the same thing." Varric leaned on the table. "I honestly couldn't think of a valid reason the wardens wouldn't want the old gods dead." "I can think of one," I huffed in irritation, "but I don't want to believe it." "Care to enlighten us?" Farron asked as he and Varric stared at me. "Grey Wardens use darkspawn blood, mixed with lyrium and a drop of archdemon blood to create new Grey Wardens," I explained. "You think they want to keep the old gods alive just so they can keep their order going?" Varric asked. That doesn't seem to align with their purpose, Farron remarked. That's not their purpose, I replied as I considered the thought. But without fresh archdemon blood, the wardens are on a clock. They can only make as many new Grey Wardens as their supplies last. But that shouldn't be an issue since they'd gotten more blood from the archdemon we killed in Ostagar. So I'm thinking that their leaders, who have to be more concerned with maintaining the order, don't want to risk losing 2 new sources of archdemon blood in case the Darkspawn become a larger threat again. But without the archdemons, the Darkspawn aren't really that much of a threat, Farron pointed out. They can only reproduce by creating broodmothers, and while they can make thousands of Darkspawn over their lifetime, it's never enough that they'll be a genuine threat to anyone without leadership. He's got a point, Braids, Varric nodded in agreement. You think the wardens want us to leave the old gods alone so that they can just keep making new wardens? Do you think they'd sacrifice thousands of innocent lives 2 more times just to keep their order alive for a while longer? Wardens will do whatever is necessary to achieve their goals, I said. I want them to know that I will be traveling to the tombs with the intention of slaying the old gods and stopping the blights once and for all. I recommend they work with me. Otherwise, I'll need to show them that it's not the old gods that need to be feared these days. That seemed to send a shiver down Varric's spine. Still, he bowed his head. I'll send word to the wardens of your intentions. When I get a reply, I'll be sure to let you know. Thank you, Varric, I smiled. It's my pleasure, he bowed and took his leave. Farron looked at me. Do you really want to fight the wardens over this? I shook my head. Of course not. But I'm not willing to leave the old gods alive while 7 can still use them to gain power. They have to be taken off the board. I don't disagree. Farron sighed and crossed his arms. You know I'll stand with you no matter what you decide. I just hope we don't have to make an enemy of the wardens. So do I agreed. It took a few weeks for all of the leaders of the Taigs to arrive. Balin had even arrived as the newest lord now that he governed Gwaran. The city was full of commotion with the news that the assembly would be voting on the next ruler. As far as I was aware, there weren't any other contenders for the crown for once, making it possibly a first in dwarven history. Candidates couldn't cast a vote for themselves, but their proxies could. Candidates were allowed proxies in cases like this to represent them in the assembly if they were a Dashir. In my case, Rika was my appointed proxy. The day of the assembly arrived and I was summoned to the assembly chamber. Since I was expecting the summons, I was already prepared in one of my finest gowns. The gown was made of thick garnet cloth with polished brass Oradoom studs. I wore my customary armored pieces to accentuate the outfit, emerald jewelry, as well as the ring Frandlin had given me when he had proposed. The people were cheering for me as I made my way to the assembly building, shouting their hopes and joy as I passed. We stepped into the assembly's waiting chamber, the stone doors closing behind us. The cheers from the people were muffled now, but were still very audible. I approached the familiar sight of Steward Bandalore with a smile. The steward bowed his head. Princess Oradoom, it's good to see you again. I suppose this will be the last time I can call you that. I gave him a curtsy in response. If I'm being honest, Bandalore, I hope it's not. But I will do whatever duty the assembly believes I am needed for. Bandalore stepped forward and gave me a hug. We were old friends by now, and he'd been the steward since I was born. He'd watched me grow from a little girl with powerful aspirations into a woman with humble hopes. You've always been so dutiful, Princess. Our people are lucky to have you, and I may say, I think you'll make for a marvelous queen. I gave him a resigned smile. I don't suppose this is where you tell me the vote has already happened, so I don't need to be here, is it? Bandalore stepped forward and gave me a hug. We were old friends by now, and he'd been the steward since I was born. He'd watched me grow from a little girl with powerful aspirations into a woman with humble hopes. You've always been so dutiful, Princess. Our people are lucky to have you, and I may say, I think you'll make for a marvelous queen. I gave him a resigned smile. I don't suppose this is where you tell me the vote has already happened, so I don't need to be here, is it? He laughed, remembering what happened the first time I'd arrived for a vote when I'd been working to create the surface cast. No, Princess, I'm afraid not. You'll have to endure the process this time. Are you ready for me to announce you? I stared at the old man, fondly remembering how he'd helped me learn the ins and outs of the assembly in ways Trian never really could. I gave him a nod, and he pet my cheek. "You'll make us all proud," he said before moving to the chamber doors. The guards opened the doors and Bandalore stepped into the chamber, raising his voice for all to hear. "Now entering the assembly chamber, please all rise for our first candidate. Princess Merida Oradum, paragon of dwarves, daughter of King Endrin Iaducan, hero of Ostagar, and slayer of the archdemon." The Deshirs and lords of the Tags thumped the hilt of their weapons or slapped their hands on the banisters before them as I made my way down the assembly steps, escorted by Farron. I smiled at Father, Trian, and Balin, who all sat together. I turned and nodded to Branka, Wojciech, Shale, and Rika, who were each nearby. I lowered myself into a deep curtsy. "I thank the assembly for your welcome and have answered your summons as a candidate to take the mantle of Orzammar. I am prepared to answer any questions you may have of me." The chamber went silent for a few moments before Father spoke. "The assembly thanks you for your cooperation, daughter. I am proud to see you standing there. I will ask the first question. What more do you believe you can do for our people that you have not already done?" This was a rather loaded question. It essentially asked me to tell the assembly if I was planning on continuing to blur the lines of influence between industrious commoners and nobles. I had to consider how best to answer. I bowed my head to Father. "I thank you for the opportunity to put forth my hopes for the future. In my lifetime, with the help of the assembly and our nobles, we have created the surface caste. This single step has brought untold commerce and opportunity to our people. With the creation of the surface caste, we had to address key issues that had lingered for generations," I continued. "We have addressed surface time and its acceptability within limits, so long as that exposure was to the benefit of us all. We have also addressed the issue of the casteless, giving them the opportunity to work for the betterment of our people and regain an honorable reputation in the process, thus nearly wiping out the stigma of generational dishonor." I looked around the chamber, then motioned to Farron. Standing beside me is my betrothed. Farron Oradum was born Castells, but has risen to the greatest of heights as a warrior of our people. You all now trust him to not only keep your princess safe, but see him as worthy of taking my hand in marriage. He is living proof of the potential greatness of all our people. It is my hope that we can continue to find ways to give our people more opportunities to reach their potential for the good of us all. I also hope that we can continue to expand our control and repairs of the deep roads, rediscovering and repopulating lost thags, so that we can take back our legacy that was lost to the Darkspawn, I concluded. There were a good many heads nodding in approval. "What do our traditions mean to you?" Branka stood and asked. This question coming from Branka held a great deal of importance. She was a paragon, and just like me, she embodied everything a dwarf should aspire to be. My answer to this question could sway votes one way or another. "I appreciate the opportunity to voice my opinion on this matter," I bowed my head to Branka. "Our traditions are what define us as a people. Past, present, and future, our traditions keep the foundation of our society intact. We have survived and persevered because of our traditions. However, I think we have found that some of our traditions can be changed to bolster the health of our society as a whole. We are richer, stronger, and more like-minded than ever with the creation of the surface caste and the limitations placed on who is designated as casteless. We have also found some of our traditions are so integral to our society that we would have been lost without them." I motioned to Branka, then to myself. The naming of paragons, for example, gives dwarves benchmarks of greatness to strive for. Commoners can become etched into our history through this tradition, just as Paragon Branka has been. Great kings and queens, such as my father, have come from noble lines sired by paragons. I believe that these traditions are good and healthy, and that they promote the very best in us. And I believe as time goes on, we will see which traditions will help us push forward stronger, and which ones may need to be altered to achieve the same goal. Again, there were more nods and mutterings of approval. A few decades ago, and this wouldn't have been the case. But the Deshirs were all richer now, thanks to the changes of certain traditions, so they were willing to keep an open mind about it now. Silence followed for some time before Steward Bandalore called out, "It seems there are no more questions. Is there anyone here who would like to voice any reason why the assembly shouldn't vote to name the princess as queen?" The chamber went silent. Just as Bandalore was about to call an end to this part of the meeting, a familiar voice rang out. "Aye," Balin called out and stood from his seat. "I have reasons that I should share with the assembly." This drew a commotion of shock and wild curiosity from the Deshers. None of them could think of a reason not to vote for me. However, Balin, my young brother and my ward for most of his life, was closer to me than almost anyone. The Deshers were no doubt wondering if he had some scurrilous rumor to make public to diminish my reputation before the vote. I could see the morbid excitement in the eyes of some. I made sure to take note of the ones I noticed. I turned to look at Balin in shock and disbelief. "Balin?" I asked in confusion. Balin seemed to ignore me as he addressed the assembly. "Lords and ladies of the assembly, I would like to give reasons why Princess Oradoom should not be named queen. First, we should look at the surface caste. Princess Oradoom likes to point out that it has brought wealth and industry to the dwarves, and in this she is correct. But the surface caste has become a considerable force in our society now, making up a sizable portion of our society. While we enjoy the wealth it brings to us, we also understand that it also puts power and influence in the common folk. After that," he said, gripping the banister tight, "she conspired with you all to hide the fact that she was taking the royal army, as well as many of your warriors, and a large portion of the Legion of the Dead, to retake Educan Theg. This wasn't even enough. She continued to sacrifice dwarven lives to the Darkspawn to retake more Thegs. These Thegs took portions of Orzammar's population and spread it out over the width of the deep roads, and forced the Legion of the Dead to continually patrol these large swaths of territory. Next," he continued, still avoiding my horrified expression, "she drug our people into a war no one truly believed would happen. For 3 years she left us to prepare Ostagar, using our materials with no thought of compensation, and sacrificed dwarven lives, including the lives of her best friend and her betrothed, to stop a blight and an archdemon, a duty that rests on the shoulders of the Grey Wardens. After that she continued to leave our people for months at a time," he shouted. "Each time she returned with little to show. Once she returned injured in a way we can still only imagine after fighting off Darkspawn that she encountered. And just recently, she returned from the assassination of a mage that might have threatened us in the future. I hear tell that Prince Kaelin of Ferelden fell in that battle after she invited him and his father to join her." Balin looked at the assembly, who seemed to be considering him carefully. "I ask you now, are these the actions of a queen?" No one dared speak. No one dared to signal whether they agreed or not. I stood there speechless, horrified that Balin would speak about me in such a way. I had basically raised him since he was born. I had worked so hard to ensure that he wouldn't turn into the person who would betray me. But as I stood there in the middle of the assembly chamber, I felt my heart dropping. "No," he said, and finally met my gaze. He smiled warmly and confidently. The smile threw me off, and I stood there confused. "These are not the actions of a queen. These are the actions of an empress." The title, shouted with all his might, now garnered shouts and debates from the Deshers. "The creation of the surface caste is one of the greatest achievements in all of our history," Balin shouted. "It has brought more wealth, industry, and influence to our people than ever before. The Taigs have allowed our people the chance to spread over parts of our lost dominion, parts that we have not held since our empire fell. With these 2 things alone, Princess Oradoom has reclaimed more of our heritage than any other dwarf before her." He stepped down from his seat and entered the center of the chamber to stand beside me. "She spearheaded the forces at Ostagar and slew the archdemon where even Ferelden's greatest champions failed. She has brought our golems back to us and has brought us back closer to the titans of old. She has fought alongside our warriors and sacrificed as much or more than any of them in the pursuit of bringing peace and prosperity to our people. She is the friend of legends, an ally to all. We cannot name her queen because the title is unworthy of her. She has expanded our people beyond a simple kingdom." He turned and stared at me, a wide smile on his face. "I call upon the Deshers of the assembly and show their allegiance here and now. Bend the knee and all hail Empress Oradoom." With that, he moved to kneel before me. Farron was the first to follow suit, followed closely by Steward Bandalore, Trian, and Rika. Slowly every lord and every Deshire bent the knee, shouting in unison, "All hail Empress Oradoom!" The shouts continued for a full minute until father stood from his seat and walked to me. The cries died down, but no one stood. They watched in silence as father took my hand and smiled at me. I could not have imagined a child of mine would do so much. I could not have imagined any dwarf could have done so much. I wish your mother could be here to see this. She wouldn't be able to hide her excitement for you. He turned, keeping my hand in his, and addressed the Dashirs. Today, you have all made history. You have decided in one voice that the dwarves of old have begun to reassert themselves once more. That the kingdom we have been limited to is once again a burgeoning empire. And you have chosen your empress. I see no dissenting votes, so I declare that with unanimous consent, Princess Merida Oradum shall be crowned Empress Merida Oradum, first of her name, hope of her people, protector of the realm, paragon to dwarves, hero of Ostagar, and slayer of the archdemon. The assembly chamber shook with the cheers of Dashirs, who stood and continued their cheers of Hail Empress Oradum. Balin stood and smiled up at me. Admit it, sister. I had you going there for a good bit. I could only huff and laugh softly. I nearly cried. Never do something like that again. I thought you were truly angry with me. Balin laughed and bowed his head. As you command, Empress. Hush, I said quickly. I've not been crowned yet. That won't matter to the people, Trian said as he approached and picked me up in a hug. Also, I should let you know that this was my idea. I looked up at Trian in surprise. What? Why would you suggest something so extreme? I told you years ago, Merida, Trian explained. You are the person who should lead our people. When you retook the Taigs, I saw our empire emerging once again. Then you began to add to your accolades, outshining yourself each time more so than the last. An empire is what you've begun to build. It's only right that you're given a title commensurate with it. I was blindsided by an excited hug. Rika smiled at me. I knew it. I knew you would achieve amazing things, Merida. How could we all not support you? I laughed at Rika. I suppose I should thank you then, but I hardly believe I'm qualified to be an empress. If you aren't, I don't know who is, she smiled. Wait. I paused and turned to look at Farron. Did you know about this? Farron made a mockingly shocked face. Me? My dear, how could you ask me that? I'm just a lowly warrior. I've no mind for politics or secret-keeping. I smirked at him. That's the last secret you keep from me. I'm sure it won't be, he chuckled as he hugged me tight. Princess? Steward Bandalore called softly. I turned and faced the steward. Yes? We have to make our announcement, he said. It has been decided that King Endrin will address the crowd first, then you will be allowed some remarks. The assembly will then decide on when your coronation will be. Very well, I replied and looked to father. Are you ready? He nodded. Come, my dear, let's see this through together. We left the assembly with everyone in tow. Guards surrounded us, and the Dashirs filed in behind as we left the building. Our destination was the balcony that was above the exit to the Diamond District. The last time I was there with father, I was announcing the successful reclamation of Idukantag. Below us was a sea of dwarves, staring up in anticipation. Steward Bandalore waved to the crowd. People of Orzammar, the assembly has come to its conclusion. As is his right, King Iadukan has decided to announce his successor. The crowd cheered for father as he moved forward so that he could be seen. My people, it is with great pleasure that I present to you the decision of Dashirs. It is with a mix of emotions that I must tell you that there will not be a new king or queen of Orzammar. This elicited a wave of confusion from the crowd. Instead, the assembly has come to a different conclusion altogether, he continued. Orzammar is no longer considered a kingdom by the assembly. It has instead been acknowledged as returning to its former state as the capital of a dwarven empire, and it is with great pleasure that I present to you your first dwarven empress, to be crowned on a date yet to be decided by the assembly, Princess Merida Oradum. All hail your future empress. The city shook with the crowd's elation as I stepped forward to smile and wave down at the crowd. Cheers and shouts of all hail the empress and long live Empress Oradum were chanted more times than I could count. As happy as they were, all I could see was a snare. This elevation, this position, would keep me in Orzammar from now on. I would rarely ever get to leave. I wouldn't be able to do more than rule. I would be bound to the city from then on. If I wanted to achieve my goals, I would need to convince the assembly to at least give me enough time to put an end to the old gods. If I could at least do that, then I could mostly ensure that Seven wouldn't be as much of a threat as he could be. I could diminish his ability to threaten my people. Still, I hadn't realized until this moment that becoming queen, or empress, would essentially end my ability to adventure in the world of Thedas. The moment I was crowned, I would be expected to stay in Orzammar as much as possible, and whenever I did not need to leave, which would essentially be always. Unless some foreign power requested my presence for diplomatic talks, or to attend some ceremony, I would likely never leave the city again. The thought saddened me. Was this what I had worked so hard for? Was my reward for all my efforts a leash that extended to the gates of this city? Was I willing to accept the will of the assembly, the wishes of the people, and become empress? Did I even truly have a choice? While all of Orzammar celebrated, I stood there waving with doubt and uncertainty weighing me down.